Good evening. I'll try it again. Good evening. Good evening. Nice to see you all here. My name is Julie Underwood, and I'm the Dean of the School of Education here on UW-Madison's campus. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the School of Education to this wonderful annual event. As a matter of fact, this is our 14th annual Charlotte Zolotow Lecture. For some of you, you have been here every year for 14 years. And it just seems like time flies by, and we continue to have incredible authors and incredible books to celebrate and discuss here in this lecture hall. In the School of Education, we are so proud of the work that the CCBC does, all that they do, because of course they do much more than just this lecture series. So if you would you please join me in thanking Katie Horning and the Friends of the CCBC for all the work they do, and certainly for this fabulous opportunity. Thank you. And now I get to turn the microphone, the podium, the lectern, over to Leslie Bowe, who will be introducing our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. It's really my pleasure today to introduce to you Jean Luen Yang. When it was announced that the American-born Chinese had been nominated for the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, the nomination was hailed as a sign of arrival for the graphic novel. His publisher noted that Yang was, quote, the secret weapon that makes the case for integrating multimedia into the classroom. But I also want to mark Yang's nomination as a sign of the legitimacy of Asian American literature. Since 1950, only 8 other Asian Americans have been granted this recognition. Even in its glowing review, the New York Times attempted a feat of racial erasure. The reviewer asked, "Is it so bad to grow up Asian in America? One might be forgiven for asking upon encountering American-born Chinese. After all, Asians are widely perceived to have had it easier than other minorities in the United States. Yang makes growing up Chinese in California seem positively terrifying." Yet as Yang's work shows, Asian Americans are not simply model minorities immune to racial terror. His depiction of racial trauma can't be overwritten with an appeal to the universal. The pressures of conformity affect all youth, but what gives American-born Chinese its political weight is its unflinching look at how we internalize the racial messages that surround us, how we come to privilege normative whiteness. So what I value most about this work is the way in which it poses questions about the disjunction between who we are and how we're seen. In American-born Chinese, the transformer becomes an extended metaphor for the multiple identities that we perform. Critic Tina Chin has written that identities are always fictions of our own devising, and that impersonation is, quote, not about performing someone else's identity, but about performing into being, a sense of one's own personhood. In its depiction of shape-shifting, duality, mimicry, substitution, and masquerade, of all the fictions that govern our interactions in the real, Yang's work shows us how we imagine ourselves into being. So, does the novel affirm an authentic self? Or does it reveal that what lies beneath the surface is another imposture? To me, these are the philosophical questions raised by Yang's use of fantasy, questions that strike at the heart of contemporary race studies. That Jean Yang can pose these questions in a form that teaches us, entertains us, makes us laugh out loud, that is the hope for all literature. He's also an inspiration to us audience members here. He did not give up on his dream of writing and drawing, even after being advised to give up comics so that he could get a girlfriend. After college, he realized, quote, "If I don't publish at least one comic before I die, I will die unfulfilled." Luckily for us, this is not going to be the case. He is the author of Level Up with Tin Pham, Prime Baby, and The Eternal Smile with Derek Kirk Kim. He's currently at work on a 2-volume series about the Boxer Rebellion, and has been recently announced as a writer for Avatar: The Last Airbender, forthcoming from Dark Horse Comics. He's the winner of the Michael Prince Award for Excellence in Young Adult Literature and an Eisner Award for Best Graphic Album, as well as the National Book Award nominee. Gene remains committed to education and continues to teach high school computer science. He will also be joining the faculty of Hamline University as part of its MFA in Writing for Children and Young Adults. He has said, quote, "I tell my students and my own kids to not just be media consumers, but to also be media makers. The stories of a culture that it generates are essentially a conversation about being human. Don't you want to get in on that conversation?" And so with that, I'm happy to introduce Gene Luen Yang.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. I am delighted by this opportunity to give the 2011 Charlotte Zolotow Lecture. Let me start with this. Once, when Charlotte Zolotow herself was asked where she gets her ideas, she answered by saying this. She said, "To ask where I get ideas, no matter how many books I've written, is like asking where I get the air I breathe." Now, I've actually been mulling over this talk for several months now, and I've been doing exactly this. I've been waiting for ideas to emerge in the air that I breathe. Now, during this time, I've been working on 2 projects that Leslie mentioned. The first is a historical fiction piece about the Boxer Rebellion. This will be published by First Second Books as soon as I'm done. I'm doing both the writing and the drawing. I'm not sure when I'm going to be done. The Boxer Rebellion is this historical conflict. It's a war that occurred on Chinese soil over 100 years ago between the European powers and this ragtag army of poor, illiterate Chinese teenagers. The Europeans referred to these teenagers as boxers because their martial arts exercises resembled European boxing. Now, the teenagers didn't call themselves boxers. They called themselves the Righteous Harmony Society. The other project that I've been working on is a graphic novel continuation of a very popular Nickelodeon television series called Avatar: The Last Airbender. The original series was created by 2 guys named Mike DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, and the graphic novels will pick up right where the television series left off. Now, I'm only doing the writing on this. The art is being handled by this fabulous Japanese art team named Guri Hiru, and the very first volume is going to be released in January of next year. Avatar: The Last Airbender is set in this Asian-inspired fantasy world made up of 4 different nations. In fact, every episode actually begins with the words, "Long ago, the 4 nations lived together in harmony." So what was in the air while I was preparing this talk? Harmony. Harmony was in the air. I thought a lot about harmony. I also thought a lot about comics. Now, I'm not talking about comic books or graphic novels or comic strips or webcomics. I'm talking about the comics medium itself, what Scott McCloud defines as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, intended to convey information and/or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. Scott McCloud is something of a hero of mine, not just because he's really good with SAT words. He wrote this book called Understanding Comics that I read in high school, and I don't think I would be doing comics today if I hadn't. In fact, Scott McCloud is such a hero of mine that a couple of Halloweens ago, I actually dressed up as Scott McCloud. This is hard to believe, because I thought I did a good job, but none of my friends were able to recognize my costume. And I was especially disappointed in this because personally, I think I look a lot more like Scott McCloud than the real Scott McCloud. So I stole McCloud's definition of comics. I've also stolen his symbol for comics. So I'll be using this symbol throughout this entire presentation. So I've been thinking about harmony. I've been thinking about comics. I've also been thinking about me. I think a lot about me. I'd say maybe 80% of my day I'm thinking about me. It's kind of a talent that I've developed over the years. Now, I just shared with you Scott McCloud's definition of comics. I'm now going to share with you Gene Luen Yang's definition of Gene Luen Yang. I can define myself using 3 pairs of words. I say that I am an Asian American, cartoonist, and teacher who writes and draws. Now, as I deeply pondered my own definition, I realized that each of these pairs of words actually represents an area of my life where I've experienced some sort of a division, some sort of a disruption of harmony. And in each of these areas, comics played a vital role in restoring that harmony. So that brings me to my topic for tonight. This is what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to describe to you how comics leads to harmony, at least in my life, and probably in Scott McCloud's too. So let's start with this first division. The division between writing and drawing is really a division between words and pictures. When I was young, words and pictures actually lived in harmony. I've always loved books, and the books that I enjoyed when I was a little kid used both pictures and words to convey their narratives. However, as I got older, the pictures began disappearing from my books. Now, by the time I got to the end of elementary school, words and pictures actually lived in 2 completely separate worlds. They were taught in 2 different classes. In English, we were asked to read books with no pictures, and in art, we were asked to consider pictures with no words. This separation that I experienced in elementary school is actually one that America inherited from Europe. In traditional European culture, high art and high literature are actually considered 2 separate disciplines. Whenever words and pictures came together, the results were considered either vulgar or childish or immature. They were never seen as sophisticated, and they were never seen as meaningful. So, as I went through my education, I was expected to embrace this division. And I probably would have done so happily had it not been for issue number 99 of Marvel 2-in-1. I first saw this comic sitting on a wireframe spinner rack at my local bookstore. My mom had taken me there to buy a dictionary, I think. Now, I'd seen comics before this, and I bet I'd even read comics before this. But for some reason, on this particular night, as soon as I saw that cover, I knew from the very depths of my being that I had to own it. I'm not sure what it was. I think maybe it's because the protagonists of this story, the Thing and Rom the Space Knight, are actually the very embodiment of awesome. I brought this issue up to my mom, and I said, "Mom, from the depths of my being, I want to own this." And she took one look at the cover, and she says to me, "Nope, absolutely not. Those 2 characters look way too scary. Yes, you're in the 5th grade, but we both know you still get nightmares." So, being a good mother, being a good and compassionate woman, she still bought me a comic book, but it was this one. This was the latest issue of a Superman comic. As we all know, Superman is every parent's favorite superhero. He's not very scary looking at all, unlike Thing and Rom the Space Knight. He's actually pretty good looking. He always does the right thing. He never swears. He doesn't punch people unless he really, really has to, and afterwards he feels really bad about it. He wears a blue uniform like a giant flying Boy Scout. I took this home and I read it, and in this story, the atomic bomb drops in 1986. It's 1984 when I get this comic. So the atomic bomb drops in 1986. It kills off most of the world's population. The few remnants that are left gather themselves in these small feudal-like societies that are pretty lawless. So a group of men decide to get together, dress up in medieval-style armor, and ride around the countryside on these giant mutated dogs in order to fight crime. Superman, being Superman, is one of the survivors, so he teams up with these atomic knights. In the last 3 pages of the story, it's revealed that this whole thing is actually just a dream. But it did not stop it from completely freaking me out. So this was the 80s, so I stayed up late nights thinking about the bomb, thinking about mutated dogs, about Superman, and about comics, about how this combination of words and pictures working in harmony, had done something inside my brain that neither words nor pictures were able to do alone. I grew up in the 80s when the American comic book industry was first coming into its own. Books like Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, The Watchmen, and Art Spiegelman's Mouse were proving to people, well, to the teenage me at least, that comics could handle sophisticated material in very sophisticated ways. I remember having a revelation about this in my high school English class. So for senior English, our teacher asked us to read Shakespeare's Macbeth. And in class, she talked about how Shakespeare used bad weather to represent the chaos of Macbeth's Scotland. That night, I went home and I read Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. And I realized that Frank Miller was actually doing the exact same thing. He was using bad weather to talk about the chaos of Batman's Gotham City. So for me, at least, comics proved that words and pictures could be brought together and still retain meaning and still do something sophisticated. Nowadays, this coming together of words and pictures can actually be seen all over the place, especially in literature, and especially in young adult literature. Celebrated authors like M.T. Anderson and Sherman Alexie and Brian Selznick have all produced books where words and pictures actually share the narrative responsibility. Even outside of books, the World Wide Web is actually a medium that's completely built on this idea of words and pictures coming together. And in a lot of our traditionally text-based media, like newspapers, a lot of them are actually incorporating more and more pictures. And the same with our picture-based media. A lot of our picture-based media, like television, are nowadays incorporating more and more words. This is what I think of as the comicification of America. Words and pictures are coming together over and over again, all over the place. Let's move on to the next division. The division between Asian and American is really a division between East and West. I experienced this division pretty early on. This is probably the cutest picture of me ever taken, which is why I decided to include it in my slideshow. It was pretty much downhill after this. Well, I'm the son of 2 immigrants. My dad was born in Taiwan and my mom in mainland China. They came to the United States for grad school, met, fell in love, got married, and had me. Now, all the way through growing up, storytelling was one of the primary ways that I interacted with my parents. Both of them loved telling stories, and I loved listening to their stories. My dad generally made stories up off the top of his head. My mom took a more traditional route. She asked her parents, who were living in Taiwan at the time, to send over a whole bunch of these Chinese language storybooks, and she would read to me out of these books during bedtime. Now, as an adult, I look at all of these stories that my mom used to read to me, and I realized how deeply, deeply Eastern they are. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is an actual children's storybook that my mom read to me when I was like 5 or 6. So just in case you can't figure out what's going on, a young mother is actually breastfeeding her own mom. The older woman has gotten so old that she's lost all her teeth and can't eat any solid food. So the young mother is doing this, is breastfeeding her mom while her own toddler is crying in the corner because he's hungry. This was a collection of short stories aimed at kids, all about filial piety, about respecting your parents. I'm pretty sure there's never been a Western edition of this book. Now, of all of my mom's stories, my favorite were all about the Monkey King. The Monkey King is a very classic, legendary Chinese figure, and in the eyes of a young boy, he has a lot going for him. First, he's a monkey, and boys love monkeys. Second, he knows Kung Fu, and boys love Kung Fu. So here's this Kung Fu fighting monkey. In addition, he has superpowers like an American superhero. He can call a cloud from the sky and ride it around like a skateboard. He can grow and shrink with the slightest thought. He can shape change. And my favorite when I was a kid, he has a magic stick that he beats people with. This stick, like him, can grow and shrink with the slightest thought. He normally keeps it about the size of a toothpick tucked behind his ear. Then when he needs to fight, he'll pull it out, he'll think about it, it'll grow to a staff, and he'll just go at it. I loved the Monkey King. I absolutely loved him. A lot of times at bedtime, my mom would ask me, would you like to hear that story about the Monkey King or the one about that young mother who breastfeeds her own mom? I'd always choose the Monkey King. One summer when I was a kid, my mom took me back to Taiwan to visit her parents, and there I discovered on Taiwanese television a Monkey King cartoon. I thought it was amazing. I tried to catch as many episodes as I could. But then after the trip, we came back to the United States, and I searched and searched and searched for that same cartoon and wasn't able to find it. Eventually, Western animation took the place of the Monkey King in my heart. In third grade, we had to do these biography reports, and I chose to do mine on Walt Disney. Soon after that, I became obsessed. I made it my life's ambition to become a Disney animator. I checked out as many books as I could about Walt Disney from the library. I remember looking up his death date in our encyclopedia and being really disappointed that it didn't match my birth date because I wanted to be his reincarnation. I remember going to the store and buying a giant poster-sized headshot of him and hanging it on my bedroom wall. My friends would come over and say, why do you have a picture of a creepy old man on your wall? And I'd have to tell them, that's not just any creepy old man, that's Walt Disney. By the time I got into high school, my cartooning loyalties were firmly entrenched in the West. I had this friend in high school who was really into anime, into Japanese animation. At the time, Japanese animation and comics were just starting to get a foothold in America. This friend and I would have hours and hours of argument about which cartooning tradition was better. He'd tell me, you know, Disney movies are terrible. They're vapid. Their endings are always happy. All their characters sing on key. Everything's brightly colored. There's just no room for the complexity of life in a Disney movie. And I'd say, that's fine, but in your movies, all of the characters have eyes the size of dinner plates. How can you deal with that? This fight between my friend and I in high school actually stems from deep cultural differences within comics itself. Now, most pop culture historians would say that comics, the modern comic book at least, is an American invention. The very first modern comic book ever printed was done in 1933. It's called Famous Funnies, and was done in New York. Now, within a decade, the comic book had become this mass medium with millions and millions of issues printed every month. The comic book was also exported from America all over the world. This idea of the comic book actually took particularly strong hold in the country of Japan. After that, for several decades, these two countries actually developed independent comic book cultures and traditions. Each of these traditions, each of these cultures had a single dominant cartoonist who set the tone for everybody else. In America, that man was named Jack Kirby. He is the co-creator of the Fantastic Four, of Iron Man, Captain America, the X-Men. Many, many, many of his creations have made some people millions and millions of dollars. In America, we hold him in such high regard that we call Kirby the king of comics. In Japan, that man is a guy named Osamu Tezuka. Here in the States, he's best known for his most famous creation, which is Astro Boy. But in Japan, he's pretty much worked in every existing genre, writing for every existing age group. He's done thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of work. In Japan, they hold him in such high esteem that they actually call him the god of manga, the god of comics. So we have the king of comics, and they have the god of comics. Kirby and Tezuka, they really represent two different approaches to making comic books. In America, our panels, following the tradition that Kirby established, are usually filled with bold lines and bright colors and exciting compositions. The human figures almost always idealized and always in motion. One of the overriding themes of a lot of American comics is the human individual as an instrument of power. Japan, on the other hand, usually publishes its comics in black and white, following the example of Osamu Tezuka. And unlike their American counterparts, Japanese cartoon characters are usually much more simplified and much more cartoony. The emphasis of Japanese cartooning is usually on the emotional life, on the interior life of its characters. In fact, a lot of times in Japanese comics, the emotions that a character feels are so strong that it actually affects the way that character's surroundings look. In America, comics have traditionally been published as pamphlets, usually around 20 pages long. In Japan, they've usually been published in these novel-sized volumes, and they're novel-sized not just in their thickness, but also in their dimensions. Even the panel transitions are different within these two cultures. A panel transition is how one comics panel is actually related to the other comics panel. It's how you get from one panel to the next. In American comics, action-to-action transitions dominate. This is where one panel shows one action, and then the next panel shows a different action, engaged in by the exact same characters. So in this example that I have up on the screen, in the first panel, Thor and Giant Man are engaged in the action of trying to wrestle for Thor's hammer. And in the second panel, Thor is engaged in the action of swinging his hammer at Giant Man. Now, Japanese comics did have their share of action-to-action transitions, but they also had this type of transition that up until recently was virtually unheard of in the West, and that was the moment-to-moment transition. This is where the time span between one panel and the next is actually very, very small. Japanese cartoonists used moment-to-moment transitions to establish an ambiance and a mood for their stories. All of this transition talk is pretty smart, right? That's because I stole it from Scott McCloud. Now, as I got older, more and more English translations of Japanese cartoons, comics, became available in the United States. And all of this led to the manga explosion that we saw just a couple of years ago when Japanese comics, when Eastern comics became the fastest growing segment of the American book market. So at this point, East and West had converged. They actually came together. Western readers were enjoying Eastern stories through comics. This was the only way that East and West have converged in comics. My main complaint about Japanese comics, those dinner plate eyes, are actually the result of a weird convergence between East and West. The god of manga, Osamu Tezuka, was actually a huge Disney fan. He especially liked the movie Bambi. And he believed that Disney characters were able to establish an empathetic connection with their audience because of the size of their eyes. So he incorporated that idea into his own work. And then the Japanese cartoonists that came after him followed suit. Ironically, American cartoonists around my age who grew up on Japanese cartoons took this whole concept even further. Nowadays, those moment-to-moment transitions that used to be so rare in American comics can be found all over the place. This is a page from my own work. This is from a graphic novel called The Eternal Smile that I did with Derek Kim. And here we're using moment-to-moment transitions to show one character reaching out to another. We're trying to establish a mood while this action is happening. So needless to say, my view of Japanese comics has changed since I was in high school. Now, the coming together, the fusion of East and West can be seen in how we make comics. It can also be seen in who's making comics. It seems to me that Asian Americans are actually better represented in comics than in any other American entertainment industry. We have Linda Berry, Greg Pak, Jay Lee, Debbie Huey, Jason Shiga, Martin Sendretta, Tak Toyoshima, Lark Pien. There are just a lot of us. A lot. A lot. A lot of my Asian American comic book geek friends and I will sit around over a couple of beers and talk about this. And we'll wonder why. Why are there so many Asian Americans in comics today? I'd like to share with you one of our beer-fueled theories right now. We think maybe the answer to this lies in the very structure of traditional Asian art. In traditional Asian art, image is always paired up with words. An image is never seen as complete in and of itself. It always has to be paired up with poetry. And a work is never seen as masterful unless both the image and the words are masterful. In addition, in Asian languages, a lot of times the very words themselves are pictorial in origin. So in Asia, that stark contrast, that stark division between words and pictures that we saw in traditional Europe just didn't exist. Words and pictures have always sat side by side, even in high culture within Asia. So maybe it's fitting that the medium that brings together words and pictures also brings together East and West. Let's move on to this last division. The division between cartoonist and teacher is really a division between comics and education. I experienced this division early on. As Leslie mentioned, I also teach high school computer science. I teach at a Catholic school in Oakland, California. I've been there for about 12 years. And when I first started, I'd make sure to tell my students on the very first day of school that I also drew comics. I thought it'd buy me some cool points. I was wrong. It did not. This was before the whole manga explosion, so at that point, no high school kids were reading comics at all. When I tell my students, they'd often come up to me and say, you know, I used to read comics in 3rd grade, but I gave it up. Worse than that, a lot of times when my class got to particularly difficult subjects, they would raise their hands and ask me about my cartooning career to try to distract me. So pretty soon I learned to keep my 2 careers in 2 separate worlds. Well, this mirrors a separation that occurred in America shortly after the birth of the American comic book. We've already talked about how comics started in 1933 with the publication of Famous Funnies. And we also talked about how within a decade it became this mass medium with millions and millions being printed each month. Well, educators did not fail to notice this, and a lot of forward-thinking teachers actually did a lot of research on how to incorporate comics meaningfully into what they were doing in their classrooms. In fact, the Journal of Educational Sociology even dedicated the entirety of one of their issues in 1944 to this topic. Now, comics definitely had its detractors among educators. A lot of parents and teachers and librarians believed that comics actually hindered literacy rather than encouraged it. They believed that the pictures in comics were drawn very crudely, that the stories were really immature, and that the lettering in comics was so small that it actually physically damaged people's eyes when they read them. Well, eventually these anti-comics people found a champion in the man of Dr. Frederick Werdum. Frederick Werdum was a child psychologist working in New York City at the time. He specialized in working with juvenile delinquents. And in 1954, he published this book called Seduction of the Innocent, where he actually argued that comics causes juvenile delinquency. He later was called in as a key witness to what are called the comic book hearings. This was where comic book publishers, authors, and artists were brought before the United States Congress to defend their art form, to prove to them that it didn't actually cause juvenile delinquency. The hearings actually ended inconclusively, but they did damage the reputation of American comics beyond repair. After this, self-respecting educators all over the nation refused to touch comics at all. So comics and education had effectively separated. For me, my two professions eventually reconciled in a very strange way, in a very unexpected way. I'd been teaching for a couple of years when one afternoon my department head came to me and said that one of my colleagues in the math department had to go on long-term leave. He asked me to sub for his Algebra 2 class. Now, I had a problem, and that was that at the time, I was also working as the school's educational technologist. This meant that I would help teachers integrate technology into their classrooms. So for this Algebra 2 class, I'd actually have to miss a couple of sessions every 2 or 3 weeks. This is terrible for the students. What this meant for them was they would actually have to have a sub for their sub. It's absolutely a terrible situation. So to make up for it, I decided to try to videotape my lectures. I videotape my lectures. I try to spice them up with a little bit of special effects. I would clap, and then the whiteboard would magically erase itself. But even with the special effects, this was actually an unmitigated disaster. My students would come up to me and say, you know, Mr. Yang, we thought you were boring in person. But on video, you're unbearable. So as a second try, I decided to draw my lessons out as comics. I did this very quickly with no penciling at all. I did it with a Sharpie on typing paper. All of my lessons would come out anywhere between 4 and 6 pages long. Then I would Xerox them, give them to my sub, and ask my sub to actually hand them out to my students. This, unlike the video, was actually a success. In fact, I had students come up to me and tell me that they actually preferred me in cartoon form. I was very, very intrigued by this entire experience. At the time, I was working on my master's degree at Cal State Hayward. I got a master's in education. And originally, I had planned on doing my final project on how to use technology in education to fit in with my role as educational technologist at the school. After this experience, I decided to change the emphasis of that final project to comics in education. First, I built a webcomics, an interactive webcomics version of all those lessons that I had drawn for my students. And second, I looked at all the literature that had been done on comics in education. I looked at all the research that had been done. A lot had been done in the 40s and 50s, and then a lot had been done fairly recently. There was very little in between. What I found through all this research was that comics as a medium actually has a lot of very, very unique strengths as educational tools. First, comics are visual, and our students love the visual. They're very used to the visual. They're used to looking and watching as a way of taking in information. However, unlike other visual media, like animation and film, comics is a visual medium that requires them to read. So in a sense, comics builds this bridge between media that our students read and media that our students watch. Second, comics are what I call permanent. And let me explain this. So a lot of visual media, all visual storytelling media are fleeting. The images are there 1 second and gone the next. This is true for film. This is true for animation. For comics, that just simply isn't true. The images are static. They're permanent on the page. And what this means is that for a comic, past, present, and future sit side by side, juxtaposed next to each other. For a reader of a comic book, the reader controls the rate of information exchange. The information flows from the comic into the reader's brain as quickly or as slowly as she chooses. And she can read the same passages over and over and over again until she gets it. No other visual medium allows that kind of flexibility. So for my students, when I created those comic strip lectures, it was like I was giving them a remote control. They could make me go as quickly or as slowly as they wanted, and they can make me cover the same material over and over and over again by simply rereading portions of my comic. I am definitely not the only educator who has recognized the educational potential of comics. On the campus where I teach, this is a picture of my campus. On the campus where I teach, a lot of my colleagues have incorporated graphic novels like Mouse and Persepolis into what they do in their classrooms. These same graphic novels have even found places in college campuses all around the country. A lot of courses now use both Mouse and Persepolis in addition to a plethora of other graphic novels. In fact, nowadays, educators are so enthusiastic about using comics in the classroom that there's even a national organization that's dedicated to it. The National Association of Comics Arts Educators actually has a website where they've gathered lesson plans and syllabi and all sorts of other course material from all around the world, all about how to use comics effectively in the classroom. So comics and education, which had been separated for so long, are finally coming together. Nowadays, I feel incredibly lucky to be an Asian American cartoonist and teacher who writes and draws. And not just because of the harmony that comics has brought into my life. I really believe that we are in the middle of a graphic novel revolution right now, a graphic novel renaissance, where many of the best comic books ever produced in this country are being produced right now as we speak. So, let me end with a little bit of advice. Do you feel the need for more harmony in your life? If so, might I suggest comic books? You can read them, you can write them, you can draw them, you can do all of the above. Comics, honestly, has done wonders in my life, and probably in Scott McCloud's too. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.